with the new bill from the '86 Texas legislature is to gather data to start and spark that discussion if SP or IEP at the SP or IEP meetings, and discuss your students' progress in their language development and to create an action plan to minimize if they have more needs. And why do we have the age range from 0 to 8 is because it's the most critical period of language acquisition around the first 5 years of development. And the reason for that is because they have a lot of flexibility in their brain and they're able to absorb a lot of information. Research has proven that the lack of language access has a negative impact. Cognitive delays are caused by that, mental health difficulties, the low quality of life, and high chance for trauma, and limited health and literacy. Next slide, please. When a child is learning sign language, or if they're learning through spoken language, they follow the similar patterns and timelines when they're acquiring language. And when they're beginning to talk or signing around the same time, it doesn't matter if they're using the voice or signing. Typically, the talking, their first word about the same time, whether you're using sign or voice. This is not a full list of the milestones. These are the typical examples for what we're seeing in the hearing and the deaf child. Using the milestones can help families and educators to see where in that range the student is related with their milestones and language acquisition. Milestones is the monitoring tool that can help us to monitor and make sure they're on the correct path for a successful outcome. So birth to 1 year old, we typically see the babies or toddlers start smiling when they're either signing or talking to them. They'll smile at them, they'll make facial expressions, and they start to mimic sounds or signs, and they comprehend no, and they should comprehend no. My kids sometimes don't seem to comprehend no, even though they're not at that age. They enjoy playing peekaboo games. They start to use their first real words in sign language as well. From ages 1 to 3, they're able to respond to simple commands, and they can use 2 to 4 word phrases, and they're listening, or they can listen to stories, and they're able to expand the vocabulary, and they start understanding the sequencing of events. From ages 3 to 5, they can use 4 to 7 word phrases, and they can use, WH questions like who, what, when, where, those type of questions. And they can understand 5,000 words or more. It doesn't mean that they use them all, but they have some concept of 4,000 to 5,000 words. And they can pay attention to short stories, and they can answer simple questions. They also understand about time concepts. Next slide, please. So connectivity. Next slide. The theory of action. I believe that with the process of getting assessment results and data that is created from those results, plus we have an annual monitoring of that data, and what that results in is an improvement in the student outcomes that they can at that time determine if intervention is necessary. Basically, on the bottom line is that language delays can be prevented. Next slide, please. The qualifications for House Bill 548 language acquisitions. Number one, the student must be in the age range of 0 to 8 years old by September 1st. So for example, if you have a student that has a birthday on September 2nd and they become 9 years old, they still can participate in the assessment. And the reason why is because at 8 years old, if they're 8 years old on September 1st, the student has to be identified as either deaf and hard of hearing or deafblind. And the third thing is the student must also receive specific language acquisition services. The language instruction by a special education teacher, a deaf education teacher, a deaf-blind teacher, or a parent-infant advisor, and or a speech pathologist. And it could be a combination of all of those, but it must be a minimum of having one of those. So the whole school must get parental consent for those who qualify to be assessed. The parents' consent, parental consent, is separate from the 3-year evaluation for special education services. Those are two separate things. It's possible that they could use the same assessment tool for both purposes, the special education services and House Bill 548 assessments as well. It could be the same, but the consent for both are separate. So I wanted to clarify that and make sure it's clear that those are two separate consents. The schools should reach out to the family when they're ready to start doing their assessments and get their consent for the assessment. Understanding this will be happening on an annual basis until the child is 8 years old. The reason why we wanted to get the consent is to make sure that we can track the child's progress every year annually. Starting this year being the first year, and the next year we can start tracking the data to make sure that they're on the right track. Next slide, please. And what information are we collecting annually is we're going to get the demographic information. For example, their age, their gender, their race, their disability, etc. And next will be instructional arrangements, the time that's spent in the instructional environment. And the third is specific language acquisition services that are provided, like I just mentioned in the previous slide. That has to be given by a special education teacher or a deaf education teacher or a teacher of blind and deaf-blind. And a parent infant advisor, SLP, speech and language pathologist. Hearing amplification. One example would be like a cochlear implant, hearing aids, an FM system, or it could be a combination of those. Like a student could have a cochlear implant for one ear and a hearing aid in the other ear, also using an FM system at the same time. And we want to document all of those so that we can advise how they're able to access and acquire language. Also, we want to know how long they're using the equipment. If the student does not use any kind of those, any of that equipment, that's fine. We just document that they're not using anything. And number 5, the preferred mode of communication. Like, what is the child using at home? Is it spoken language? Is it signed language? Is it tactile, or a combination of those? Some students can sign and use their speech at the same time. And then after figuring out which one that is, then we can have more specific, like if they have a specific sign system that they're using, then incorporating that into sign. We're not just saying specifically C or ASL, just we combine that as sign language. And lastly, the assessment tools that you use to assess the child. The schools will provide assessments annually, and they might choose more than one test to assess with. And then we'll use the highest score for tracking purposes. And at the end of this PowerPoint, I have a list of different tools, and you can click the link to see all that are already approved list of assessments that they're able to use. Next slide, please. Also, these are two very important pieces of information. All identifiable information will be redacted. And every student will be assigned to a special ID number for tracking purposes. Next slide, please. Now talking about strategy, what our plan is and what we're going to do. Next slide. This is the annual progress timeline. So all schools who have already identified the students that are qualified for the data collection, and I explained that in House Bill 548 explanation earlier, they'll start testing annually in September in the fall. And it must complete all the assessments by May and in that same school year. All of that data will be uploaded and finalized by the end of June for TEA to gather, all the information and create a report. And then that report will be updated to the Texas Sensory Impairment webpage. The report itself will discuss general state findings with the progress of deaf or hard of hearing or deafblind children and their language acquisition, as well as allowing for annual monitoring of the data. The progress monitoring will help us to create an action plan if needed to minimize the gaps in the language acquisition. Next slide, please. This is really the same progress, but it just looks a little bit different. Starting with the assessments that we get the parents' consent for, then we can go ahead and start the assessments. And we'll be collecting data to upload. And at the end, TEA will draft a report that will include statewide results, but not any specific student information, just general statewide results. And potential recommendations if we're starting to see that we need some interventions if necessary. Next slide. Resources. This is information for you. You can click on and see. So for families, you can become, families can become resourceful. And the results from the annual monitoring for language acquisition, as well for information to discuss with the school professionals to make sure that their child is on the right track in acquiring language. Doesn't matter if they're using spoken language or sign language. These results are being discussed during the IFISP meeting, or you could discuss it separately as a standalone meeting, either one. As a family, you need to discuss the gaps if you need clarifying that to be clarified, the gaps for your language acquisition. We also connect with professionals to make sure the services that are provided are standardized and consistent. If you have the teachers, the speech pathologists, the interpreters, and family members, all of you will be providing access to language for your child. Understanding that it takes a village to raise a child, it's that same concept here. And we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page as well with the services that are being provided to make sure that they have have an improvement in the language acquisition for the child. And then second, we want to give grant access to deaf and hard of hearing and deaf blind peers. Most of the deaf children are for hearing families, so we want to give the child an opportunity to connect with other deaf and hard of hearing or deaf blind children and adults. That interaction that they get from that will have a very positive impact and direct exposure to language that the child really needs as an opportunity to increase their vocabulary and their awareness. Another option would be to attend the deaf blind or deaf and hard of hearing camps that they have where students have that interaction and socialization opportunities from there. And the third one is we want to connect and build a bridge between other families. It's very important for families to be able to work together and share ideas. And our state is very large. Every region has their own unique way to access services. The research shows that family engagement plays a critical role in the education of children. And at the end of this presentation, we also have a list of different organizations that you can check out if you're interested. And the point being, language development is critical. Partnering with families and educators and schools is a very important part of that process. Families and professionals need to work together and be open to asking questions and answering questions. Next slide, please. On this, if you see the first link on this slide, if you click on that, then they'll pull a list of approved assessment tools to be used with House Bill 548. Also, the second link gives you a direct link to the website, and it already has a list of different resources under the state guidance. So if you click, you can click at those and see which resources are available, understanding that annual statewide reporting will be uploaded to that same web page every year. Next slide, please. You see this long list of different organizations that provide assistance to families for deaf and hard of hearing and deaf blind children. There's a variety of them that are all over the state of Texas. So please take some time to click and check out those links if you have not done so thus far. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about takeaways. Next slide. I want to really emphasize two things. House Bill 548 will help families to take that additional steps to monitor your child and language acquisition aligned with the school. House Bill 548 also will allow families to empower their child to have a successful outcome in their educational career. Next slide. So I'm ready to open up. If anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me. I have my phone number and contact information there, so I'll be happy to answer any questions if we have some at this time.
This is Michaela. Thank you so much, Emily. We are going to give everyone just a minute or two to put their questions in the chat box, and Teresa and I will monitor those and see if we get any that come through.
Okay, sounds good.
We do have one question ready for you, Emily. It says, will children with unilateral hearing loss also be included?
As long as they've been identified as deaf or hard of hearing. We really struggled to identify the student with a unilateral hearing loss as deaf, but honestly, if the child has one side that has hearing loss, one ear that has hearing loss, they should be identified as either deaf or hard of hearing, and then they would be able to access, that would be a greater ability to access, whatever they can hear. But if they get diagnosed as deaf or hard of hearing, then they can be involved in this assessment as well.
Thank you. We do have some other questions. How can the educational interpreter at the elementary level support the data collection process in coordination with House Bill 548?
Really, it varies. There's different ways. It depends on what kind of assessment that you're planning to give. Educational interpreters can work together with either the teacher or the diagnostician that's providing the test. If a general education teacher is providing language access and the educational interpreter needs to be collaborating with the general education and the special education or deaf education teacher to provide that instruction. And they need to be there for that support, a support system for the students.
Hi, this is Teresa. We have another question. How will House Bill 548 bridge relationships between families of DHH and deafblind children and grant access to DHH and deafblind peers?
If we identify the gaps in the language acquisition, that's one way to bridge that and to give them that access. There's many different ways. The schools need to include maybe in their IEP or IFSB the different things that need to be provided for language acquisition to peers. So you include outside agencies, stakeholders, to have them involved with the student's education. There's really a lot of different ways. We should already be doing that at this point. The schools should be. You can include high school deaf education classes, working together with the elementary kids. So there's just a variety of different ways that it can be done. And this bill, I think, will help to clarify what that should look like and how we can continue to provide that access to deaf and hard of hearing or deafblind peers and adults as well.
Thank you, Emily. We have another question. Does the House bill address the potential differences in data from a school that inputs in September versus another who inputs after a full year of instruction in May?
Right now, the answer is no. And that was one concern that we've already had and we've discussed with how we are able to address that for next year and 2 years in the future's data collection. If a student reports data early in the year and then next year they report it later in the year, then we can see some progress, but at the same time, is it accurate progress or not? So we are considering maybe putting in a date when you need to give the assessment, so we know that we can look, and that would help us more in the tracking and monitoring of the data. However, the school should be informing the family about that information, and so we already have that information to give them the assessment and discuss the timeline. And if we have long gaps in between assessments and the student has really improved a lot, maybe it's because of that long timeline. There's a lot of instruction they've received during that time period. So discussing that with the schools, but we are also on our end trying to coordinate how we can do that for next year's or 2 years in the future.
Okay, next question. Who at TEA will review this data, and then what will be done with it?
I have access to that data, and I'll be the one that'll be reviewing that with several other people that are on our assessment team. We will be monitoring that data, and also we'll be sharing that data with HHSC, Health and Human Services Commission, and their ECI program for early childhood intervention, as well as Texas School for the Deaf. And the three of us will be discussing the data and how to develop a plan and what to do and how we're able to back up and support those gaps that are done statewide.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does this include homeschool DHH students?
As long as you receive special education services, then they can be included, yes.
Okay. And next question. Are 504 children covered under House Bill 548 or only students being served in special education?
Right now, currently, the data collection is only for students that are in special education. 504 kids are not included, specifically because of the world. Specific language acquisition services is really related with special education services that are being provided, and 504 kids would not be included. Maybe in the future, we can try and see if we can fix that and include them. I think that would be great to be able to track that and see all the students and how they're doing with their language acquisition.
Okay. What if the student is not receiving specialized language acquisition and FIE is showing no need for language speech? Do these students need to be tested?
No, they have to meet those requirements. They have to be in that age range of 0 to 8, deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf blind, or receiving specific language acquisition services. If they don't have those, then you're not going to be assessed.
And it looks like we might have our last question. Does TEA have an example of parent permission to test students and report data?
TAA currently is in the process of creating parental consent forms for the schools to be able to track and use. These are the minimum information that's required on a consent form. And right now it's in the process of being reviewed, and then it'll be disseminated soon. The schools can do the assessments only after receiving parental consent.
Okay, next question. When will the form be ready?
As soon as possible. I'm just waiting on the higher ups to approve it, and then it'll be disseminated to everybody. Hopefully it'll be soon.
Okay, thanks, Emily. This next question is actually for me or Michaela. As far as the presentation that is being recorded, how can we go back and watch this? We will be downloading and sharing the presentation on our website. And so we'll also probably email the link to you all after the presentation is terminated. Give me a day or so to get that done, and we'll get it out to you all. Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions for Emily?
I just wanted to throw out there that when you share that recording, I'll also upload that to our website. So it'll be all in one place that you're able to see it there as well.
Okay, it looks like we have reached the end of our questions. Thank you, Emily, for your time today. We appreciate you very, very much. And I know that we all look forward to your presentation. I hope you'll do this with us again when we have any new updates to share. Michaela, is there anything you'd like to add this afternoon before we end our webinar?
No, I would just like to echo those same sentiments. Thank you very much to Emily and for partnering with Texas Hands and Voices. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar, which will be taking place in December. If you don't know about what to expect or what's to come in those following webinars, you can look on our website at www.txhv.org/webinars. The information and the registration is there. In addition to sharing the recording of the webinar today, we will also be sure to share that PowerPoint that Emily has created so that you guys can have access to all of those active links. Just thank you guys for being with us today. We know that it's hard to get away for lunch, but we hope that doing these during your lunch hour gave people a little bit more time to join us. So thank you all very much. We hope that you have a wonderful week. And again, thank you for joining us, and many, many thanks to Emily and our interpreter, as well as our captioner for today. You are all very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. I also encourage everyone to visit our Facebook page. We do advertise so much of what we do on our social media. So I encourage every one of you to find us on Facebook, Instagram, and we actually tweet too. So if you can find us on Twitter, we do share lots of information about our webinars and upcoming events there as well. So thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.